Hello everyone and welcome back to another video. Today I'm going to explain the solution to corruption. So just as a general idea, corruption in the modern world is just this idea that businesses are going to take government favors, get money from government because they can become friends with government officials or bribe them or lobby, all that sort of stuff. So then through lobbying and through these forms of corruption, the politicians become more favorable towards the businesses, and they get in office and implement laws that are extremely favorable to these businesses, and through giving them things like subsidies or writing regulations in their favor, all that sort of stuff. So, what is the solution to this? So one solution that a lot of liberals argue for, in a sense, would be just this idea that we need to keep more of an eye on corporations to stop them from spending this money, to stop them from lobbying, to stop all this sort of stuff. This isn't necessarily the root of the problem. I think more of the root lies with the politicians. It lies with the fault of government. Because these businesses, what they're doing is simply defending themselves from the government. The government has so much power over them, power to control their business, power to regulate them, power to take their money, power to do all these sorts of things, all these negative things to them. And if they don't have a presence at the government, then the government can do negative things to them. They can regulate them. If they're big enough, they can use antitrust laws again, which are completely arbitrary laws. But that's for another video. So in general, these businesses are just defending themselves from the government. And so ultimately the solution would have to be from the government. So I think ultimately the solution would be give government less power over the economy. Separate government from economics. That's more or less the objectivist argument for this. The idea of separation of state and economics in the same way and for the same reasons as the separation of church and state. You don't want the government propping up certain religions, just as you don't want the government propping up different businesses. That's very damaging. It leads some to succeed more than others. And just ultimately hurts society in a sense, because you only have people buying from one group in the same way that you only have people thinking in terms of one religion. So it's ultimately restricts people's freedom in that sense. And in the same way, the government, by propping up one sort of business, is ultimately taking away the ability to compete from other businesses, because when you have the government backing you, you can't compete as well. And it's the same thing with regulation. This is why big businesses love regulation, because they have the ability to take on the burden of this regulation because of how big they are. However, these smaller companies, they don't have as much financial capital to bear the burden of these regulations and are ultimately put out of business in favor of these larger businesses, which are actually ironically helped by these regulations, which is just one example of the government trying to do something and having the exact opposite consequence of what they could want from it. So ultimately, the main idea is that the government cannot be involved in economics. That's a very, very damaging way to structure the government, and it ultimately leads to corruption, as these businesses will just go and try and defend themselves by lobbying and trying to get regulations passed that don't damage them as much or that damage their competitors. Because when you have a mixed economy where the government's so involved, the government ultimately decides what companies will win and what companies will lose, and it decides, so these businesses will have to go through the government for everything, for all their business decisions. They have to. So the companies that are in bed with the government will be a lot more powerful than those that are not. So usually these bigger companies have more of an opportunity to be in bed with the government, than these smaller companies. And ultimately, by giving the government so much power, you are giving companies this ability to determine how force is used. Since the government has a monopoly on force, these businesses, when they can push the government to do certain things, you're giving these businesses the power to essentially use force, but it's through the proxy of a government that we've allowed to initiate force, which is very, very damaging because force limits the mind and ultimately leads to less freedom, less ability for individuals to be happy. So yeah, ultimately, the solution to corruption would be get the government out of the economy. That's really the only way that we can solve corruption at its root. So I think that's all I have to say for today. Thank you guys for watching, and I hope to see you guys in the next video. Peace.